Evan, that was a really awesome introduction. I appreciate it. I feel really special. Okay, can everyone see my slides, or can somebody just say yes, they can see my slides?
Not yet.
Oh, not yet? Okay, let me just share my screen here. Oh, that's good because I have to do share screen. That's why. Now?
It's coming on. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Great. All right. Well, again, thanks, Devin, for that introduction. And thank you for all those who helped us planning this talk, especially Mary Lou, for fielding all of my questions about time zone. I grew up on the East Coast, was in the West Coast, and on Central Time, but for whatever reason, Central Time Zone always confuses me, and it shouldn't. So thank you, Mary Lou, for that, and really appreciate everyone listening in, especially on Zoom again. I know that many of us wish we could be in person, and I hope that will happen soon. Please let me know if you can't hear me or something like that. You can just chime in because I'm not going to be checking the chat. So just let me know if there's something off. So today I'm going to talk to you about a project that I've been working on with Michael Esposito, who's also at Washington University in St. Louis, Frank Edwards at Rutgers, and Ellis Monk. And so although unfortunately we can't be together and we're on Zoom, but one of the things that's really great about Zoom, and Devin and I were talking about this before I started, was that you can have lots of people, you can bring lots of people to the table. You can have people from Zoom from all over the world, which is kind of cool. And actually Mike Esposito is here and he's gonna probably participate a little bit in our Q&A because we're really excited to get feedback from all of you. So he's here, he's hiding now, but he's here. So we're about to field a study. It's been delayed a couple of times because of COVID, but we want to share with you our plans and some preliminary results. We're really looking forward to your feedback. So I want to first set the context here. We're going to be talking about police-involved deaths. And these are civilian homicides that occur through contact with law enforcement. And this organizes mortality in the United States. Police violence is a persistent feature of US social life, as many of you know, and many of you in this Zoom audience have studied. And so from our prior work, and this is work with Mike Esposito and Frank Edwards, we know that police are estimated to kill approximately 3 men per day. This is in the US, and to be responsible for about 8% of all homicides with male victims. And police killings are also the 6th leading cause of death among young men. Go to my next slide. So risk of police-involved death is estimated to be many times greater in the United States compared to any other advanced industrial democracy. And in its most extreme instances, police in the US are estimated to kill more individuals over the course of days than law enforcement do in similar countries in years. And this sort of outsized rate of police-involved death has positioned this phenomenon as a critical point of inquiry among both legal scholars and health scholars, as well as many social scientists. We also know that race looms large in explanations, or racism, in explanations of police-involved deaths in the US. And scholars and activists in the US have argued, as evidenced by the killings of many people, including Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Charlene Lyles, Stephon Clark, Tamir Rice, and many others, that fatal police violence, and in particular deaths, is highly racialized. And in empirical work that I've done with Mike Esposito and Frank Edwards really supplements this claim. So we show, for example, that people of color are about 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police compared to whites. And these risks are particularly pronounced for African American and Latinx males, with approximately 1 in every 1,000 Black males and 1 in every 2,000 Latinx males or Latinos males expected to be killed by police. And this is compared to 1 in every 2,500 white males. And discussions of racial bias in policing are not new and really reflect a long history of racial violence and control. that some scholars would argue have never meant to keep Black people safe. So here I have a 1969 quote from James Baldwin, and I'll let you read it. And I think it's quite illustrative for many reasons. One is I think it reflects, so the tenor of the quote reflects, unfortunately, similar tenors of discussions around fear of police and fear of being racially targeted, even now in 2022, right? So while this is a quote from 1969, some of the themes are the same. This is problematic for many reasons. We can talk more about that too in the Q&A if you'd like. So before I talk a little bit more about sort of racial group heterogeneity and risk of police death, I just wanted to mention this photo credit is by an artist named Cephas Williams, who has a really great project called 56 Black Men, and I encourage you to check it out. Okay, so while, as I just discussed, while prior research demonstrates that there are these large racial disparities and risk of police-involved death, our understanding about how race structures fatal police interaction is still blunt, right? So we really lack important information about context and factors that shape interactions with police. And this comes and thinking about discussions when presenting work about risk of police violence, racial work on racial disparities and risk of police violence, questions around context and other factors came up again and again. And we know from other empirical work that there are social inequalities, not just between census-defined racial categories of Black and whites, but also within social groups. And one of the one key area to think about is skin tone differences as an important source of stratification in this regard. And this is among Black populations and Latinx populations. I'm going to focus on Black populations here. And we know from work of our co-author, Ellis Monk, and others, that lighter skin toned individuals have been shown to experience better outcomes across a variety of measures. And these include things like educational attainment, earnings, marriage, and emotional well-being, but they also extend to the criminal justice outcomes as well. And so work shows that darker skin tone individuals experience higher rates of arrest, incarceration, and longer sentences for crimes. Physical traits like skin tone are key markers of race, and there's cognitive research to show that heightened perceived Afrocentric protypicality, and examples of that are things like darker skin tone, more stereotypical Black features, are associated with harsher and more frequent stereotyping, such that individuals with darker skin are perceived as more likely to be dangerous or criminal, and thus more likely to experience negative bias in interactions with the criminal justice system. And Ellis Monk, one of the co-authors for this project, has found that skin tone stratification is so salient in this domain that at times disparities in criminal justice contact, when we're comparing very light-skinned and very dark-skinned individual-toned African-American individuals, really match intraracial inequalities among Blacks and whites. So the same differences we see between Black and white populations for the criminal justice contact measures he's used are mirrored when comparing very light-skinned and very dark-skinned African-Americans. So our aim here is to describe how the risk of police-involved death varies among Black populations according to skin tone. And we hypothesize, like other sort of negative criminal justice outcomes, that the risk of being killed by police varies among African Americans, so it's not uniform, and that we'll see that darker skin toned individuals experience significantly higher risks of being killed by police compared to their lighter skin toned peers. And we also hypothesize that given how tightly coupled racist perceptions of criminality and disposition are with skin tone, we predict that disparities in risk of police-involved deaths between darker skinned and lighter skinned Black populations will approximate risk inequities between white and Black populations overall. And so this project, we think, innovates in its approach in how, in examining how race shapes fatal civilian police interaction by our focus on skin tone, as well as other measures of phenotype. And I can expand upon those later. For this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the skin tone measures, but there are other measures of protypicality, Afrocentric protypicality, et cetera, that we are planning to explore for this project. We think that pooling individuals into broad racial categories. Sorry, I have a new cell phone and I don't know how to silence it, but I'll just move it away from here. So indeed, pooling individuals into broad racial categories and assuming that risk of police-involved death is uniform across all individuals is a useful methodological convenience, but it's a synthetic assumption that disregards what we know about the nature of social categorization, right? So, just categorizing individuals as Black or white, for example, really disregards fine-grained information about risk heterogeneity that might otherwise develop our understanding of how individuals are processed and interpreted by the criminal justice system, right? So in this case, examining how bodily features that cue Blackness and therefore evaluations of fear and human worth that accompany those traits could structure mortality risk and inform our understanding of how broad racial biases underlie everyday interactions among law enforcement and civilians. And then also help us to understand how police-involved homicides are generated. So this seems like pretty straightforward, but there are actually a number of challenges in constructing estimates, even of skin tone. So I'm sure some of you are already thinking about some of them as I speak. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the moving pieces or the pieces that we've been thinking about, as we've been constructing the survey. And of course, we're really looking forward to your feedbacks. I'm sure there are things we're missing, assumptions we're making, questions we're not asking that we should be thinking about for this kind of analysis. So just to get us all on the same page, we're going to use, for this project where our data is coming from Fatal Encounters. This is a novel open source project that seeks to document every instance of police killing in the US. I'm sure many of you have heard about Fatal Encounters and related data collection efforts. So I'm going to try to be brief here, but I do want to provide some detail because there are sort of aspects of the Fatal Encounters data that are critical to our project, and also just might also impact how we think about setting up our survey and interpreting results even. So just to begin, in response to the shortcomings of official data, and this journalists, activists, and researchers have been collecting data counts of police-involved deaths through public records and media coverage. And the methodology, so this is a crowdsourcing methodology, but it has been endorsed by the Bureau of Justice Statistics as producing high quality data on police-involved mortality as something that they're replicating in different ways. And again, we rely on data from Fatal Encounters, and this seeks to document all episodes of fatal police-civilian interactions in the US. Fatal Encounters is a public web-based data source. And the sample universe is inclusive of any reported death that occurred during an encounter with the police before formal admission into a detention facility. So this is going to include homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths. In all cases are fact checks against published accounts before they are added to the public data set by the editor. And I'll go back to the types of deaths we included, because we did not include all the deaths that Fatal Encounters collects. And again, cases in Fatal Encounters are identified from news reports and public records. The team has conducted systematic media searches for deaths involving police in the US between 2000 and 2021, along with open records requests for particular jurisdictions. And this is where all the variables are derived. They also rely on obituaries for additional demographic information about victims, such as age and race ethnicity. And they also rely upon social media images and accounts for additional demographic information, including race and ethnicity. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because that's what we're using for this survey. So again, like it's always important to remember that the fatal encounters data collection method really depends on the production and accessibility of public records and media reports. And so it's subject to negative bias and count estimates. So cases are going to be missing if they were not reported by news outlets. And if even if they were reported by news organizations but not published online, then they're not going to be part of the fatal encounters data. And so this has led to significant undercounts, especially in the earlier years of the data. So some researchers rely on sort of later years where we know there's been more robust internet reports of police related deaths. But despite these limitations, the fatal encounters reports far more cases than are documented in official data and similar public efforts. So while there is likely an undercount here, it's way better than what we've had in the past. So in addition to providing a fairly comprehensive list of all individuals who've been killed by US law enforcement, again, with the caveats of underreports in earlier years and maybe in certain areas, Fatal Encounters also attempts to recover high quality images of each homicide victim. These images are often drawn from social media accounts, and they are used to ascertain race, which is not often reported by news outlets, and especially if was not provided in obituaries and other kinds of information that they gather. So importantly, we also, just from some prior analysis, know that in any given year since 2015, approximately 85 to 90% of the victims have photos available. And this number has increased over time. So right now you're just seeing two randomly selected images of individuals in the Fatal Encounters data from the links that they provide. One thing that Fatal Encounters notes, for those of you who've explored these images, is that they don't own any of these images and have removed them when asked by the owners. To date, that's only happened twice, but it's something to consider. They also keep images on their own servers because we know that links go rotten very quickly, unfortunately. And this is also useful for us for our survey because we can utilize those links instead of having to worry about rotten links, which can happen. Okay, so the availability of these high resolution photographs in Fatal Encounters can uniquely allow us to recover racialized bodily features of each victim, and then leverage that information to further describe social variation in the risk of being killed by law enforcement in the US. So as we discussed before, trying to get more at these additional contextual factors. And in this case, we were interested in skin tone. Just checking to make sure. Okay, so skin tone has been measured a variety of ways across a limited number of nationally representative surveys. In many cases, and here we're just talking about surveys, there are other ways that skin tone has been collected in experimental settings, and I'd be happy to talk more about those in the Q&A as well. In many cases, the interviewer is asked to determine the skin tone of the respondent. And we utilize a measure of skin tone that's derived from the National Survey of American Life. So the original version had a 7-point scale, and you'll actually see it in a few slides, in a couple slides, I think it will be coming up. And it included, in addition to very light and light, it had somewhat light, then medium, somewhat dark, dark, and very dark. And we're using a 5-point version of this scale. So for those of you who are not familiar, the National Survey of American Life is a national sample of Black and non-Hispanic white populations in the US, and includes African Americans and Afro-Caribbean immigrant groups. This data was collected in the early 2000s. And in the case of the NSAL, they actually used racially matched interviewers. So the skin tone estimates they have are from I think almost exclusively, but I think others in the audience can let me know who've used the data, racially matched interviewers. Okay, so we might think that skin tone is a readily accessible measure given access to these photos. But again, there's some important issues to address when considering this measure. So first is that we are really interested conceptually in understanding how a person is generally or widely perceived by outside actors. And in this case, we're particularly interested in police officer perceptions. And this is challenging because unlike age or BMI, there's no true measure of skin tone, right? So we need a way to capture variability of skin tone and then build this variability into the models. And then of related concern is the reliance of one rater for skin tone, which has often been the case in prior work that's relied upon survey data. And there's a couple of reasons why. I'm going to just, there are more than a couple of reasons why, but I'm going to talk about two. And one is that we risk missing the general consensus of how a person is perceived when we use sort of a one rater assessment. Because that favors sort of idiosyncratic interpretation. So maybe relying on one person might mean we capture the rater that's the one person out of 100 who would call somebody dark brown instead of, or darker skinned instead of lighter skinned, right? And then also the use of one rater disregards important uncertainty around the degree of consensus on how someone is perceived. As again, this is the variability that we're trying to capture when we're measuring skin tone. And so I just want to further illustrate these concerns. So we can consider the above scenario here. So let's pretend that this is here just a heuristic, but where every person in the U.S. So let's say we asked every person in the U.S. to interpret the skin tone of the person shown in the photo using the question I showed you earlier. And we randomly drew a person's rating from those ratings. So here you can see there's a clear consensus about 80% of people would perceive this person as having medium skin tone. But if we just use one rater, we risk coding a rating far removed from this broader consensus. So in this case, where we see the green line, we'd be having a rating for this person as being very dark, which is highly unlikely given the way that the majority of people have interpreted this person's skin tone. So this is probably unlikely to be the perception of this person in an interaction. And then, again, in addition to like missing how someone might be typically perceived by others, relying on a single rater also, again, disregards really important variability on how a person's perceived that we'd want to otherwise bake into our model. So like if we're going to illustrate this concern, consider this hypothetical distribution. Again, this is everyone in the US for the photo shown on the left. And once again, imagine we take a single person's rating out of these data, again, marked by the green line. So unlike before, when we took a single person's assessment and the rating was far removed, this rating is dark skin tone, which is sort of the most common rating. But if you take a closer look at the distribution here of ratings, calling this a consensus perception is a bit strong, right? So there looks like there's a high chance that this person could be considered medium or very dark by some actors that they encounter. So relying on a single rater here disregards important information where a person has a high chance of being interpreted very differently from actor or interaction to interaction. So to help alleviate concerns that might arise from relying on a single viewer's assessment of an individual's skin tone, we construct a survey to collect several independent skin tone assessments for each Black homicide victim in the Fatal Encounters data set. And so to construct our perceived skin tone measure, we're going to collect 50 distinct assessments for each photo. And we are going to draw from a diverse pool of raters to examine variability in ratings by characteristics of raters, such as gender, race, and occupation. And we think this will help us to understand how this person is perceived among different groups of interest, as well as the role of racial concordance, which is something that has been utilized in prior surveys. We also think, having sort of a diverse pool can allow us to include important controls for sensitivity analysis. I just want to note that this is sort of an earlier iteration of the survey using the original NSAL skin tone measure. Again, we're going to exclude the somewhat categories, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. So our data consists of about 3,000 Black individuals killed by police between January 1st, 2015 and December 31st, 2021. with 50 independent skin tone assessments sampled for, or we plan to collect 50 independent skin tone assessments for each homicide victim. And we're beginning in 2015 because this is where there's more consistency in the availability of images. So again, I think Fatal Encounters I think in terms of availability of information on the internet, you can start earlier, but for these, if you want to be able to utilize or have a large proportion of the sample have images, 2015 seems to be the most important starting point. I want to just make a couple of notes about how we're measuring a police homicide, because this is, for those of you in this area, this is sort of a big, there's a diversity in how people define police homicide. So I just want to let you know how we're doing this. So we're focusing on homicides that are caused by police. And again, we are not focusing on, so this is without regard to the legality or justifiability of the killing. So this is just any police involved death. And we sought to include only cases where the death was a direct result of police use of force during an interaction between an officer and civilian. And so we classify as police homicides all cases in which the cause of death was identified as asphyxiation, beating, a chemical agent, a medical emergency, a taser, or a gunshot. But we exclude suicides. And in addition to other excluded cases beyond suicides, included deaths attributable to vehicular collisions. So like deaths during a car chase are not part of our part of the sample. And other causes of death from falls or drowning or drug overdoses, et cetera, are also where causes of death are indeterminate, are not included. So this is a pretty conservative estimate of police involved deaths, and we recognize that. That this also likely can impact how we might think about the interpretation of our results, and also happy to talk to you more about that as well. Especially this cause of death is indeterminate, which I've done some work on as well, is a tricky cause of death group. Okay, so again, this approach of having 50 independent skin tone assessments, we think will help us to develop a sense of both the general consensus of how each person is perceived, and also get an idea of the degree of variability and how that person might be perceived from person to person, because we know there's going to be some of that. So to analyze our data set comprised of multiple ratings, we're going to treat each of the skin tone assessments as separate plausible realizations of the data, and then we're going to analyze them as such. So I'm going to try to walk you through the details of this with an example. So here, and you can focus here on the blue column, where we'll take Rater 1's assessments of each homicide victim, which is here stored in column 1 as shown above, and treat them as a possible version of the data. So what we mean by this is that we are going to first pull out the first column of skin tone assessments and consider them as one possible imputation of every victim's skin tone, right? So if one person was assessing every victim's skin tone. And again, I just want to note here, by imputation, we simply mean a draw of a possible value for a variable. Okay, so then using each realization of the data in turn, we aggregate upwards to get a count of deaths among people belonging to a certain skin tone population within a year. So sticking again with our example, that means first taking all of the skin tone ratings in the first column from the first group of assessments and aggregating them up to death counts to different populations across different years. So in this case, if we imagine that the three people shown above were the only 3 people in our data set, that means we'd sort out that in 2015, one medium skin tone person was killed by police. In that same year, one very dark skin toned person was killed by law enforcement. And in 2021, one very light skinned person was killed. So it's really important to know, and this is where I'm sure we're going to have a lot of conversation, that the total population figure is the total number of Black persons in a year with that skin tone. Okay, so the way that we are deriving the total population counts is externally. So we're going to use the skin tone distributions provided in the National Survey of American Life. And we're going to take the proportions from this so multiply them by the total Black population within a given year. So So this is not perfect, right? And we understand that to be the case. One thing we're thinking about doing is replicating this with more recent national surveys that have collected skin tone. So like the Ad Health data to account for possible changes in the skin tone distribution over time. Because again, we need to know the skin tone distribution of the Black population to be able to create these measures. And we're really open to your ideas here. This is where we're at with things, and we'll show you sort of what our preliminary results suggest using this method. Okay, so to analyze each realization of these aggregated data, we're going to fit Bayesian multi-level negative binomial models to them. I'm happy to talk more, and I'm sure Mike would love to as well, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Okay, so after running through that process for one realization of the data, we're going to grab the resulting posterior estimates, set them aside, and repeat this analysis from the bottom up for the next collection of imputation for each individual skin tone. So again, that means that we're pulling down the skin tone estimates from our second raters, aggregating these up to deaths among people belonging to each skin tone group within a year, fit our model, and then store the posterior results. So eventually we're going to work our way through each of these sets of assessments, and we're going to end up with 50 different model results based on 50 separate realizations of the data. This again will allow us to get the variability that we want in our models. So in the end, we're going to combine the results across multiple imputed data sets by pooling the posterior draws from each of the 50 separately fit submodels. And from this pooled posterior, we're going to generate our final quantities of interest, which is, again, the predicted number of individuals killed by police per 100,000 in the population by skin tone per year. So this approach is going to lets us coherently incorporate sort of the rich information that's provided by multiple raters. But again, our results are going to be weighted towards an individual's skin tone that appears more often across these assessments. But then treating this as a multiple imputation problem, we're able to ensure that any fundamental variation in how a person is perceived is baked into our overall uncertainty in our model results. So that means like individuals who have a lot of variability in how they're perceived by others will show lots of variation in skin tone from data set to data set, and they're going to produce more variation in results from fit to fit. And in this way, we're going to be able to create uncertainty intervals. And in this way, this will be reflected in the uncertainty intervals in our final results. Okay. So I mean, we are currently working with University of Michigan Survey Research Center to field our preliminary survey, to do some pre-test, to work out any issues. So this is really perfect time to get your feedback. This has been delayed. I wish we had more, have had more data to show you or more results to show you that have come from the work that they've done, but they've just been sort of clobbered with their own issues in terms of working out our survey. But we have done some just internal analysis and we're just going to show you one example of this just to sort of get a feel of what to expect from what UM will be doing for us. So I just want to show you this sort of one of the preliminary passes we did, and this is just, again, a small slice of the data that we've examined internally. So, so for what I'm going to show you right now, we're using 2 raters from our study team to analyze photos of all the Black individuals killed by law enforcement in 2021. And again, this is just 2 raters, right? So not 50. Again, we're just trying to, I think some of the preliminary work we've done, pre-preliminary work that UM is going to do before they field our larger survey is to provide us with some more confidence and or give us a signal of what we might expect to see, and also start working out some of the kinks on our own. So again, this is for 2 raters in 2021. So among these 2 raters, and they have quite different demographic background characteristics, you'll see that, and again, so this is showing sort of those 338 ratings for each of the raters. There's some disagreement in perceptions, but you can still see that both raters point to the idea that the pool of homicide victims is skewed towards darker skin tones. Again, for the first rater, it's about 80%, and for the second rater, it's about 50%, as having either dark or very dark skin tones. So we see that. And then when we process the data through our analysis plan, so again, this is getting these expected rates per 1,000 in the population. And again, this is using NSAL's distribution of skin tones to create these estimates. So keep that in mind. But these are like our preliminary passes, and this is one example of them, suggest that the interracial disparities in risk of being killed by police do exist. So as you can see here, I mean, obviously there, keep in mind the confidence intervals here, but we do see some signal that there's differences in sort of risk of being killed by police, with those with darker skin tones having higher risks compared to those with lighter skin tones. So we do see some of the signaling that we think, and we also, I mean, again, like take this is super preliminary. These are some things we're working out just internally as we wait for to field our work. But there is also some suggestion that some of these really large interracial disparities that Ellis Monk has found in other work might also be evidenced here as well, where sort of very light skin tone, risk for very light skin toned or people rated as very light skin tone are match those of white populations. Based on prior estimates we've created with the fatal encounters data. So I'm going to stop there because I really would like your feedback, and hopefully, and I'm happy to clarify anything that I sped through that was not clear. Yeah, so we're excited to get your feedback, and thank you for listening. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, I think. Yes.